In the early 1900s, American citizens generally did not recognize the extent of the atrocities of child labor. American reformer and photographer Louis Hine expanded the consciousness of the general population to the exploitation and detrimental abuse that children in America were confined to through his photography. Hine was the driving force that pushed the American child labor reform movement in the United States.
Hine was responsible for engaging with individuals. Manny at his side, holding the flash powder. They would set up a shot, and Manny would ignite the powder, which resulted in a loud bang and plumes of dark smoke. So it was a very dramatic encounter that gives the public access to individuals who, in some ways, they're afraid of.
In the late 1700s and early 1800s, the United States was in an era known as the Industrial Revolution, which was a time period when American industries abandoned the domestic system and shifted towards the factory system. In the early decades of the 19th century, children became a key asset in the workforce as there was a higher demand for workers in factories and in the fields. As a result, children's education became a second priority. This became an essential part of the American family's lifestyle because families were unable to survive without an extra income that their children created. Instead of enjoying their childhood and getting an education, the children of the early 1900s were forced to spend their childhood working in unsafe factories for an excruciating amount of hours. Thousands of children worked in a variety of different specializations, including mines, fields, factories, and even on the streets selling newspaper. Louis Hine used the art of photography to capture those imprisoned by child labor.
Founded in 1904, the National Child Labor Committee was established with the goal of promoting the rights, awareness, dignity, well-being, and education of children and youth as they relate to work and working. In 1907, Hine received his first assignment from the committee, which was to photograph child labor conditions in mines, mills, and factories. A year later, the committee hired him as a staff photographer. With the financial support received by the National Child Labor Committee, Louis Hine was able to reach and impact a greater demographic. The years 1890 to 1913 became known as the Progressive Era. This era notably includes attempts of influential thinkers and activists to improve the United States society through reforms both legislatively and socially. According to Miriam Cohen, the Evelyn Clark Professor of History at Vassar, American politicians, journalists, professionals, and volunteers mobilized on behalf of reforms meant to deal with a variety of social problems associated with industrialization. The emerging factory system was a primary concern of the progressives. They saw the factory system as highly dangerous, providing little or no protection to employees. Therefore, progressives were major supporters of Louis Hine and his work.
At first, Louis was able to enter the factories easily. Yet, once his reputation and his purpose became well known, he often had to infiltrate the factories under disguise. Multiple times, he was forced to go undercover in these factories because if anyone knew his identity, he would be thrown out of the factories. Factory owners became resistant to Hine's photography and the progressive movement because they were at risk of losing employees and it could harm their production rates. In 1916, the United States Congress passed the Keating-Owens Act in response to Hine's photographs. This law established child labor standards, including minimum age of 14 for workers in manufacturing and 16 for workers in mining, a maximum workday of 8 hours, prohibition of night work under the age of 16, and documentary proof of age. This was one of the first legal steps made against child labor. But this law was proved to be unconstitutional, meaning that the government was resistant to the movements made as a result of Hine's photos. The court quoted in Hammer v. Dagenhart that it was not intended as an authority to Congress to control the states in the exercise of their police power over local trade and manufacture, always existing and expressly reserved to them by the 10th Amendment.
Hine's candid photographs of these children created a nationwide outcry. Child labor became similarly compared to slavery. At the start of the 1900s, about 12% of children worked, but by the 1930s, only about 2% of children worked in the United States. Despite the positives, the introduction of progressive thought and labor legislation brought some negatives. For many impoverished families, their children were primary sources of income. Therefore, once restrictions on child labor were enforced, many families were pushed deeper into poverty. Amir Radfar from the U.S. National Library of Medicine quoted, "Some argue that poor families would be even poorer without the supplemental financial contribution of children. Lack of money will deprive them from the basic needs of food and shelter, which will decrease their survival rate."
Hine's efforts initially impacted multiple important steps against child labor. In 1913, the Children's Bureau was transferred to the Department of Labor in order to prioritize the safety of children in the workforce. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was enacted to provide regulations on factory owners regarding their children employees. This act established a minimum wage and maximum work hours, and it restricted employment of children under the age of 16. These are both initial evidence that Hine's photos successfully accomplished his goal of protecting children's health and their lives as they worked in unsafe environments.
Through his practice of the freedom of speech and free press, Hine was able to impact the process of protecting the children of America in the workforce. Due to the awakening of the American people on the subject of child labor from Hine's photography, regulations on underage workers became a top priority in Congress and has remained that way throughout the years. Today, there are many safety regulations regarding underage workers in the workplace, and restrictions to the kind of work that they can perform.
Well, we generally keep our 16-year-olds up at the register, so they're not really... The only safety regulations are they can't run the compactors, they can't get on a ladder taller than 3 feet. If they work a 5-hour shift, they have to take a 30-minute break, and 30 hours a week for 17 and older, 20 hours a week for 16 and younger.
According to the federal child labor laws that are enforced today, minors under the age of 16 can work 8 hours per day and 40 hours per week during a non-school day period, and during a school period, 3 hours per day and 18 hours per week are allowed.
Louis Hine's art of capturing images through his camera exposed the epidemic that is the unsafe environments for children in the workforce in the early 20th century and sparked the revolution against child labor.